All right. And we're back. And we're joined by Fred. It's been a little bit, definitely since Fred has been on the show, but definitely since the show has been on. Apologies to our loyal, I believe it's 55 subscribers, might be 56 now. And everyone else who watches. Semester just started, and so it's been quite busy. But we're back with Fred. We're very happy to have Fred on. And then hopefully soon I'll have another episode coming out with Elliot. So some hopefully making up for a little bit of the lag of content over the past month or so. Fred, we're very happy to have you here as always, joining us from
Mhm.
sunny England. Hopefully
Yes,
you're doing
thank you.
well.
I'm doing very well. Thank you very much for having me on again. It has been a while since we last spoke. Um it's just been quite a turbulent past year for me, especially over autumn. I was just not in much of a position to do much kind of content stuff, and it was just some personal stuff going on. But yeah, I'm really happy to get back into the swing of it. I'm hoping gonna do some more writing soon, more recording, but we'll see. But yeah, thanks.
Yeah, no worries.
And yeah, and yeah, it's very hot here at the moment. It's because we've had a terribly dull summer. It's probably been one of the dullest, coldest summers that I can actually remember in my whole life. And like in there was some stat I saw that it's been the coldest July since the 90s or something, since the early 90s. And whilst everyone has been saying how it's the hottest July ever in the history of the world, it's like, well, I mean, it's not. Come on, we've got
But
all
but
this
see
rain and clouds.
if you overlay the
Yeah.
weather map with red,
Of
then it's
course,
hotter.
of course, if we just do a bit of just change the color scheme and change the parameters, of
Yeah.
course, that makes all the difference. But
Yep.
I
Yeah.
don't know if you just sort of like just observe what you can actually see with your
Stop
eyes and
noticing.
ears.
Stop noticing.
You might notice something a little different, and then you
Stop it.
might start to be a bit confused by this gulf of
You you can't
perception.
notice. You can't notice things. It's not allowed.
There's
Stop
there's this
noticing.
quite wide gulf between, people's experiences and, you know, official narratives in science, but I'm struggling a bit with
We
this
s-
gulf.
we trust the narrative at this at the Wandering Humanists. We trust and support our globalist masters. What?
Of course, I love
Um.
no, I love the narrative too, but it's just a little harsh sometimes. Maybe we need to have a few HR complaints and stuff like that.
Well, the HR
But
department is eternal and will never leave. So there, if there's anyone to complain to, it's definitely them. So
but no, seriously, I've been really disappointed in how it's been such a cold summer, and in now we're having some like 30-degree September. I don't know what 30 is in Fahrenheit. It's
'80s.
some highs of 30, 80s.
Yeah,
I believe you.
mid to high
And so we're,
'80s.
we're having we're having this belated summer, which beforehand I was thinking like we are owed this. We're owed something, something nice, and fortunately it delivered. And so I'm just really looking forward to having a nice September weather-wise. And yeah, it is. I mean, it is hot, as in because no one's ever prepared for hot weather here because no one has any air conditioning units. We have,
Yep.
like, we have in people's homes, they have no need for them for like 95% of the year. So, so people struggle, but it is nice just to have finally some proper summer.
Well,
And
in the spirit of
yeah,
talking about weather, and now we'll do my best to try to tie
yes.
this into what we're talking about today. Yeah, no, the Pacific Northwest, I feel like fall is not quite here yet, but it's
Hmm.
almost here. And the nights are getting cooler, and even some of the leaves have started changing, which makes me happy as somebody who
Sure.
enjoys the fall. Um,
The leaves are slightly on the turn here, and they started to get darker in the evenings, which I'm not a huge fan of. But we do have some proper sun, and yeah,
well,
it's cool.
speaking of
It's called an Indian summer when
yes,
there's a lot of sunny, summery weather in September, October months. But I don't think that word is very politically correct anymore. So I doubt I'll be
it's
seeing
not,
that many.
but you
I
said it,
doubt
not
that
me, and you're
in
British,
the
so
in the era of George Floyd, which is obviously a global phenomenon, this bizarrely global phenomenon, I think the idea of calling it an Indian summer is not going to be very well liked anymore. So, I
probably
mean,
not.
I'm going to call it that because that's just what that's just the British phrase. But that's yeah, that's what it's known as. But Probably
Well,
not
in the
very
spirit
politically correct anymore.
yeah, in the spirit of things getting colder, slightly colder, a little bit darker, we're gonna talk about a short story today. It's one of my favorite short stories from one of my favorite short story authors. So I appreciate you letting me impose it upon you. Although I
Sure.
do hope you enjoyed it as you were
You're
finally started to read it. We're gonna look at um, Whistle and I'll Come to You by M.R. James. One of so who was a late 19th, early 20th century British slash English specifically writer of ghost stories. Also, he had a whole academic career, which we'll get into a little bit as and sort of antiquarian manuscript studies. He did a lot of stuff with manuscripts when he wasn't busy writing ghost stories. His academic work, as usually happens, this is a similar thing with Tolkien. The academic work is usually forgotten, and the fiction work is really what people tend to remember. That's interesting. Maybe hold on to that, fellow academics. Nobody will remember your academic work. It's the fiction that people remember. M.R. James wrote a lot of stories about sort of haunted objects, haunted books, haunted places, haunted people. Um, he is remembered as one of the sort of those I don't want to say pioneers of the British ghost story, but he is remembered very much as one of the writers who helped bring the genre into the 20th century. Out of sort of the later romanticism, dark romanticism, into the Gothic, and then into the 20th century. So if anyone has read M.R. James, you probably know what I'm talking about. And if you haven't, I highly recommend that people do check him out. All of his stuff is in the public domain. Um, he was a huge influence upon H.P. Lovecraft. H.P. Lovecraft wrote very highly of M.R. James. That's actually how I got interested in M.R. James, was from being a fan of Lovecraft, and then trying to figure out or read through the people who influenced Lovecraft. So kind of doing the Turtles all the way down journey. That's what I've been doing. But yeah, there's Whistle and I'll Come to You is one of his more well-known stories. There was a very I like it. There was a I believe it was early 70s BBC, I think it was one of the ghost stories for Christmas adaptation of the story, shot all in black and white with Michael Hordern, who some people may know as I know him as an audiobook narrator, and he did a lots of other stuff too. Um, so I'll try to. I believe that it's about an hour long adaptation. I believe it's up on YouTube. So I'll try to link that in the description. I recommend it. It is different than the story, but also there's some notable differences, but it's also very similar, and they do a really good job of capturing the vibe, for lack of a better term. So yeah, the BBC adaptation is real good. I liked it. They do a lot with a little, a lot of cool, very low tech, inexpensive camera tricks that really do produce a very unsettling mood. And so that's cool. Yeah, so I guess that's as clumsy of an intro as I can muster, but from the weather to dark stories, something like that.
Mhm.
Um so I guess we'll get maybe slightly autobiographical. Fred, had you ever read any M.R. James before?
No, I'd not really heard of him much. I mean, I'm not a literary person. I haven't really studied English properly, and since I was about 16, you know, officially. But so you are sort of explaining my culture back to me. You're culturally appropriating me, and this is like a pizza effect kind of thing. No, of course not. I trust your judgment very much. No, I'd not heard of no, I'd not really heard of M.R. James before now, because I'm not a literary, I'm not professionally a literary person. I've not really studied English literature properly since I was about 16. But uh, yeah, we did a bit of Wikipediaing together actually last time we were on a call together that wasn't recorded, and we were going through, I was going through, summaries of his views and his academic work, which sounds really interesting. In fact, I've just got up here something about how M.R. James's scholarly work uncovered the burial places of the abbots of Bury St Edmunds, Edmund of Walpole, Henry of Rushbrook, Richard. So he's clearly been a very consequential academic, even though he's probably remembered more for his ghost stories and horror stories. Um, and yeah, I get the impression he's in this in this vein of that time he was working in, where people were being disillusioned with sort of hyper rationalism and you know dismal science, for lack of. I don't like the phrase dismal science. I'm just using it as a reference point here. And he was a general kind of reactionary person, and yeah,
He
kind of
wasn't even
late
yeah, and he wasn't even that. We don't. My impression is he wasn't even that reactionary politically, although he had some definitely more.
Sure,
But he was more just personality wise, like just a general
sure, yeah.
reactionary personality.
I
Um, Not
I
super
get
pleased with the modern world so much.
sure. Well,
Yeah.
it wouldn't. It kind of resonates with how you'd write a lot of ghost stories and how you'd want to sort of try and remind people of you know actually spirits and demons. Maybe they do exist. Actually, maybe all this science stuff hasn't completely nullified the idea of, I don't know, spirits and
Yeah, yeah.
whatever it may be.
The
So yeah, I
disenchantment of the
it would
modern world is a false disenchantment. I think is something that people
sure
that you can have you can have flying machines and telegraphs and telephones, but why does that necessarily exclude the
mm,
existence of the supernatural?
sure
That's
sure
yeah.
it wouldn't surprise me that his disillusion with sort of modern progress kind of lends itself to writing horror stories.
Oh,
So yeah, there's
100%.
there's some yeah, there's definitely some connection
And a lot of
there.
people
And
have talked about
yeah,
this. Lovecraft is another example. I mean,
sure,
Lovecraft is very
sure,
nihilistic in many ways, but there is, if not an explicit right wing leaning, there is something reactionary, conservative, small c in the sense of like, no, we don't need all this stuff. To a lot of horror, not all horror, but particularly, I think I liked what you had to say there about ghost stories in particular, because of the inherently. I mean, ghost stories are not like it's not like Texas Chainsaw Massacre where it's like actual
of
humans doing
course,
actual horrible things. It's
of course,
post it's ex humans, people
sure,
who used to be humans. So there's an explicit supernatural slash spiritual understanding of the world in ghost stories.
sure.
And
But
and oftentimes too there's it's sort of unclear, at least in a lot of Mr. James's stories, what exactly the spirit is. And he does a really good job of not telling you too much really what's going on. He just sort of
mm,
inserts you via the characters into these situations, and there's hints and clues that you, right, as a reader, can attempt to place together, and probably some good interpretations, but ultimately he doesn't explain a whole lot, which is also really nice. He does not explain. He just inserts you into the world of the supernatural, and it's like, how do you feel about this? Oh, I don't like this. Okay, that's a good ghost story,
sure.
right? Yeah,
Not only is there not much explanation, but it's just a short story, so you are just sort of thrown in there more so than if it had been a full novel without much explanation. So,
yeah.
and there is a lot to be there's a lot to be thought of, and sometimes if there is supposed to be allegorical themes in it, there's definitely references to. I mean, there's explicit references to like difference between Protestant and Papist attitudes to things, as if that's like a more obvious theme that is playing in here, which I'm curious to talk to you about because I'm not sure entirely. Well, I'm just curious what for second opinions on that.
Oh yeah, I have a lot to
But
say on that. So, but but
yeah,
you're the guest, so I'm letting you. Yeah, yeah. Keep following the rabbit down the hole.
sure, yeah, and what was I going to say?
Yeah, I mean, well, we could just start with like a
Yes,
brief. People can read the story.
sure, yeah,
it's not a very long one. It's a good one.
hmm.
I will also in the description link to a YouTube channel that I recommend called Classic Ghost Stories, and it is a channel run by a fellow countryman of yours, Fred, who's Tony Walker, who does really great readings. I really like his readings of older British ghost stories. So you can listen to it. You could read it. It's a very short story. I actually I prefer to listen to ghost stories read aloud, and that's not just because that I'm dyslexic, although that's a large part of it. I always retain more when I hear, but there's something about ghost stories being read aloud that reminds you of, you know, campfires. Maybe that's a more explicitly American kind of thing, but like sitting around a low light source at night, hearing somebody tell you something spooky is great. I really like that. The story itself is pretty simple, as we've been saying, without, you know, and we'll jump into the specifics as we see fit, and depending on what we find interesting. But basically, hyper rationalist, very modern, um, British uh, professor um, decides that it's time to
He
improve his golf game, which is
he's a professor of ontography, which I had to look up. Which I've just got a definition here. It's the division of geography, which concerns with the responses of organic beings to their physiographical surroundings. So I guess the responses of organic beings to their physical, the 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 visual cues of their physical environment, which I guess is kind of plays into the story a bit. But yes,
it does.
it seems to be it seems to be something that doesn't concern itself much with
Yeah,
more metaphysical
yeah,
ideas. But yes.
yeah. So Professor Parkins, right? He's at Cambridge. He's very young, and he thinks he understands everything. And he's very he doesn't like any talk of ghosts or spirits or anything beyond what can be measured. Sort of, I mean, obviously, M.R. James is writing in a very different time period, but when I first, this is part of the reason why I suggested this story is because, like, oh, like your standard shit lib, like, you know, well, maybe not even that, but your standard internet atheist kind of like, oh, like, if, you know, what if God real, why'd bad thing happen type mentality, actually
or
kind
even
of person. So,
or even it could be also be a shit lib I mean outside of religious. I mean, obviously these days we're now at this point where, you know, basically all politics is theology. So to talk about modern political ideals kind of is just completely natural to it, whether it's, you know, about being religious or an atheist. But it could just be a shit lib who, I don't know, gets confronted with a more kind of raw reality of of life, which suppose isn't supposed to happen in their lib utopia, and you
well,
know,
and that's a
it
common,
could
yeah.
be, yeah, it could be that on top, because that itself is basically a kind of religious awakening, and
Oh, yeah.
where that's just the way people's religious outlet, or the muscle memory they had from centuries gone by, which they might have devoted to actual religion, is now into like policy and stuff like that, you know, really awful stuff. But
Acknowledging
yeah,
historical guilt
yes,
and things like this. Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. Too bad. Yeah. It's no, and then that's a common theme in M.R. James's stories in general, that they're not all of his protagonists are like Parkins. Not all of them are quite so
Mm.
like staunchly rationalist, materialist, but the idea that, you know, protagonist who is we're getting very semiotic here, protagonist who is very learned in one particular aspect of life confronts a completely different aspect of life, namely the supernatural, and is completely freaked out and doesn't know what to do, because it doesn't, that part of life, or beyond the part of life that's beyond this life, doesn't conform to what, you know, is taught
He's
at university. And it's interesting, I just one more thing too, is that Mr. James was you know, worked in the universities, worked, was very much part of the university, and was very successful in his career at the university, but he is also willing to call out the university, or academia we would probably say in a more American context.
mm,
And I like that. I like that he's willing to do that. You know, they always say write what you know, and so he's writing in a sense what he knows, but then is also simultaneously, they're not always explicit digs, but there's some funny moments, there's some darkly funny
mm.
moments in his stories, including this one where you can't help but have a little bit of schadenfreude, a little bit of chuckle at, like, you know, man, you really should have known better, uh
Mm.
Professor Parkins, you should have
This
known better. but the idea too that like he takes his protagonists outside of their norm, right?
Sure,
It's interesting because like some of his stories tend to fall into a couple different, well, multiple different categories, but in some such as this one, the learned professor character is taken outside of the university library and then has to confront what is practiced and done out in the, you know, the rural areas of England, where traditions, beliefs, and powers are still very much alive. But then others of his stories too, and Fred, hopefully you want to come back on and talk more about this because he has a lot of
mm,
really good stories. Also tended to he also sets ghost stories inside the university, and so there's like library ghost stories with haunted books and things like that. And so
sure.
and it's not hard to see how this influenced HP Lovecraft, right, with like the Necronomicon and things like that, haunted manuscripts. So he does kind of James tends to have like he's willing to kind of have the supernatural appear both in and outside of quote unquote civilization. In this story, it's definitely in a rural location. Right, Parkins, the young professor, wants to improve his golf game, which is just very funny that that's his motivation. He'll take a holiday to the coast, the east coast, I believe Barstow or somewhere near there, and improve his golf
But
game.
he's going to a place called Burnstow, which is actually not a real place, but
I
it's
figured,
a
yeah.
a version of apparently a place called Felixstowe in Suffolk, which is in quite a nice part of the country. There's some nice parts in the east. But yeah, so I think the
Is that
goal
East Anglia? Sorry, as somebody who's not familiar with, that's East
just check
Anglia, right?
Suffolk is, let me just, I'm pretty sure it's, yes, no, yeah, it is in East Anglia. It's
Yeah, that's what I thought.
yeah, it contains the sort of further east, the furthest east point of England, and it's, you know, a kind of Anglo-Saxon epicenter sort of thing.
Yep.
But yeah, I get the impression that the golf thing is basically an emphasis on how he's sort of taking himself out of his own work, is in an environment where he's not even thinking about his work very much when this is happening. You know, this might have happened when he was, I don't know, when he was working. Or maybe I think in the story he's not supposed to be completely off. His mind is completely off work. But yeah,
Yeah.
I think the golf there is to kind of emphasize how he's been thrown off his garden more so than if he had just been working in Cambridge whilst this
Yeah.
happened to him. Yeah, and
Yeah. And just
I was
go ahead.
just another quick thing with what you were saying about the university environment, which he was I don't know, feeling critical of because of their own hyper rationalist attitudes. I mean, this story was published in 1904, so it was sort of preceding the stuff that you hear about with C.S. Lewis and how he was given these tenured high positions in Cambridge and or Oxford, whichever one it was, I can't remember. And you know, he was literally he himself was getting this great backlash for being a Christian apologist. And this is, you know, this is back in the 20s and the 30s, you know, it's even back then, I mean, there was these hostile environments in universities. Like nobody really, everyone thinks that this wokeness on campus thing is such a recent phenomenon. It goes back a pretty long way, about 100 years now. And whether it's about religion, or I recently I've been reading this other book about economics called the Keynesian Episode by William Hutt, who's basically talking about what university economics departments and were like back in the 30s and the really hostile environment there was to people that weren't believers of the new Keynesian religion. Like, so the idea that hostile university environments to people that were, you know, stuck in the past in whatever it might be, whether it's about God or about economics or just any kind of Victorian thinking. You know, the word Victorian was steadily becoming this bad word that it clearly is today. I mean, well, now today we talk about the 1950s as the is now the new Victorian as like the bad word, but of course the 50s was when Victorian was the equivalent the 1950s of like bad association.
No,
But
that's a good point.
yeah, so it's interesting that this if if he's sort of feeling his own frustrations with his experiences in universities and how this is predating C.S. Lewis. It's just interesting to
That's a good point.
think how different it is from that. And yeah.
Yeah. So let's so just to finish the summary. So he goes to this fictional place. This is also pretty
Mm.
common in ghost stories. Like Lovecraft does this too, right? Like Arkham, Massachusetts doesn't really exist, although we all like to believe it does. At least some of us. I'd like to go visit. Actually, I wouldn't like to go visit Arkham. It sounds like it's a place where madness reigns. So he's out walking. Well, actually he encounters a Colonel Wilson, and who he's playing golf with. And
The Globe Inn is the
the
name of
Globe
the
Inn.
inn. Yes.
Yes. And so Colonel Wilson is of a very different bent. Let's say Colonel Wilson is a staunchly Protestant, low church Protestant. Does not like
Mm.
anything that is like any high church Anglican service. He probably would not approve of. It'd be far too popish, far too Roman Catholic. So there's a little bit of, I found that very funny. I
Sure.
think that's a little bit of humor that M.R.
He's
James is inserting into the story. So you got to have a little humor.
It's interesting that he's a sort of low church Protestant and a sort of anti-Catholic Protestant, but then he's also talking about how, yes, I do believe in spirits and supernatural, and which you might not think is a
Actually,
characteristically hyper
that's
Protestant thing.
actually it
So,
really depends, because
it
it
does.
really
Yeah,
depends.
I'm sure it does depend,
historically
but
historically
yeah,
there have been a whole, now I tend to think this is another aside, but that's what this channel's about. This channel's about interesting asides. There
of course,
if you look at low church Protestants in places, which is so different, totally different region of the UK, but if you look like
sure,
in Scotland in like the 16 and 1700s, just because you
sure,
were a low church Calvinist didn't mean that fairies weren't real. uh it was actually
of course,
it
yeah.
was it was actually still totally part of the folk belief.
Mm.
So um I
So
think
certainly as
this,
you
this
get,
is a view, this is sort of a some largely anachronistic view that we project onto the past, that Protestants, quote, were always rationalist because
sure,
certain
yeah,
types
of
of
course,
Protestants were rationalists. But then there were, I mean, you look at like the OG Protestants, like Luther was not living in a modern world at all. It was a very medieval world. And even like early Anglicans were not
yes,
operating in this hyper rationalist way. And
no, of course
even
not.
John Calvin wasn't
That's
either. I mean,
that's
it's
more of a it's more
modern
of an
thinking.
it's more
Yeah,
of an American post hoc, to be honest.
yeah, it
Things are
is.
always much different in Europe, and of course, as you're saying, if you go to Scotland, the further you get to kind of Nordic countries, the a lot
Well,
of the myth, even though a lot of the most horrible kind of horror story myths were kind of done away with by Christianization, a lot of it was maintained, and even to this day, there's like believes in gnomes and stuff in
well,
Iceland.
yeah. I mean,
So yeah,
Lutherans,
so yeah, of course, yeah,
my
yeah, yeah,
tribe up in Scandinavia. I got to talk about my tribe.
sure,
My tribe up in Scandinavia. It was never
hmm,
really, for most of like the Protestant period up in Scandinavia. And this is something I can't speak to. I wrote a freaking dissertation on it. For
hmm,
most of the even the Protestant period in Scandinavia, like the belief in the supernatural never went away, and it was
no,
always
no,
recontextualized. So when you have the first round of, this is true for Scandinavia and also for England, even you have essentially two religious conversions that happen. You have the pagan to Catholic Christian,
yes,
Church of Rome conversion, which is the big conversion. But then you have a second
hmm,
conversion, which is
sure,
the Reformation. And every time, so if you look at how people in Northern Europe, before the hyper rationalist modernist period, you look at the way they practiced like their religious life, you can easily see the two conversions sort of layered, like almost like a fossil layer. You get the pre-Christian, you get
sure,
the Catholic, and
sure,
then you get the Protestant. And the idea that like those, so that once people become Protestant, those other two layers go away, is completely unrealistic and just not attested
hmm,
by the evidence. And so like the idea that just because somebody's a low church Protestant, they don't believe in like the potential of hauntings or possessions. I mean, that is, again, that was only one kind of like hyper autist Calvinist that did away with it. The rest of even the Calvinists were totally fine with keeping all that stuff. I mean, if you look at sort of, I know we have a mixed viewership here, so to talk about America, if you think about like the crazy Puritans, right, in
Of
New England, I
course.
mean, that's a very supernatural worldview. Like the witches are stealing my cream. The devil was banging on my door last night. Was it the wind? Yes, but it was also the devil. I mean, like the idea that like this went away, the belief in the supernatural went away, is like I like what you say. It's a very American post hoc kind of way of
Sure.
viewing.
No, yeah,
You know,
well, I guess I was just sort of spitballing. I'm curious the what really is the main force behind a lot of this doing away of superstitious beliefs, and maybe it is mostly coming out of America, despite what you say about witches and all that. Um,
well,
maybe
I think it was
obviously,
maybe America
yeah,
wanting to
mm,
rid itself of the historical guilt of the Salem witch trial. So maybe I think that's part of it. Is
sure. No,
we
that
have
played
to
it.
remove.
Even though most stuff that people believe about witch burnings is a load of crap,
Oh, totally.
because, like,
Oh,
for
totally.
example, 75% of accused witches were acquitted. I
And
mean,
they weren't burned.
that
They weren't burned.
yes, they weren't burned. I mean,
Hung or
there was
pressed.
some brutality. For example, the last person to be executed for witchcraft in the UK was someone that was put into like a barrel of hot tar or something like that. So, like, there was brutality, but, like, the conventional way of telling it is often just influenced through films, and films are there to exaggerate. And so, yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, just the fact alone that there's things like 75% of accused witches were acquitted. I mean, that fact alone just kind of goes against quite a lot of stuff as a great starting point. But yes, we digress a little bit.
We
No, yeah,
digress. Yeah.
it
So
could,
and so just to kind of give
yeah.
people the who maybe haven't read it, there will be some
Mm.
slight spoilers here. So he's out walking one day on the beach and he finds the ruins of a I believe a Templar church.
Templar Preceptory.
Yes. And he finds a whistle, an old whistle. And the moment he finds the whistle and puts it in his pocket, he notices somebody appearing to run towards him along the beach. Seems to be a human running at decent speed, but never quite getting closer to him. And then that figure continues to kind of always be uh almost reaching him but never gaining on him. It's a strange kind of thing. um Later that night, he actually does the thing that you should never do in a horror slash ghost story. If only the protagonist knew that they were in a ghost story. He pulls it out, and then he cleans it off and he finds an inscription on the whistle, and then he reads the inscription aloud. Again, these are just things you shouldn't do.
There are
It's like
there are two inscriptions,
two
aren't there?
inscriptions.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mm.
two inscriptions. um yeah, and then he he reads them aloud, and particularly the second one, qui est iste qui venit. Yeah, Latin phrase. It means who is this who is coming. And then in a very we could say prideful perhaps display of superior knowledge, is like, oh well, I apparently you just got to blow the whistle and then you know who will be coming to you. And he blows the whistle, which you shouldn't do, obviously. And it sets off a sort of a series of scary supernatural occurrences.
Yeah, he starts tripping balls
Yes,
in a sense.
that's the medical term, is he's
Yes.
tripping balls, all of
He
them.
starts yes, he starts having a little hallucination. And I mean, lots of other people have done that, blowing on pipes and things before in a modern context, but there was a different influence there, some actual chemicals.
Yes.
Anyway, sorry.
Oh well, if
Sorry,
you
that
walk the
was cheap.
streets of Seattle, you'll see some people blowing on
Oh, of
some
course.
pipes,
Yeah,
and they're
yeah.
having also their
Yes.
own little hauntings.
Yes, but they
It's pretty
probably
fun.
don't have Latin inscriptions on them, sadly.
No, it's
Uh,
like
mm,
ridiculous pipes made out of like plastic and shit. So that's the Seattle version.
of
So yeah,
course.
it's always been more grungy up here. We can't have cool old Templar pipes. So we have to have like repurposed trash. We're not quite as civilized as you British, don't you see? Um,
Wait, and you haven't seen, well, as long as you find the darkest parts of Brighton, then, I'm sure we
Oh,
can
I'm certain. Yeah,
we
you
can
get
we can
get
we
it
can
too.
approach sort of Seattle, San Francisco. Maybe we can certainly never get close enough, but we will
Because America
approach
will always beat
the
you out on
closest
everything.
the closest you'll get is somewhere in the darkest corners of Brighton, which is by not a coincidence is the only constituency in the country with a successful Green candidate in Parliament. That's all I need to say on the matter. Sorry,
Yes.
carry on.
Brighton was Mods Rockers, right? Wasn't that where the fight all the fights went? Wasn't that Brighton? Brighton Beach? Wasn't that where all the fights
There
in the
was
60s were going on?
there was probably a lot of fighting there.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
yeah,
I
yeah.
think so.
I imagine.
I do need to make it
Anyway,
over there at some point and
yes.
check
Oh
out the
no,
motherland.
Brighton is actually a nice place to visit. It's just it's got a lot of stuff that's quite
Beach, but
dark.
it's coastal, right? And beach towns always have weirdness. So I say that as somebody who
Sure.
lives in a coastal beach town. So
No, it is a it's a pebble beach as well, and there's quite a lot of pebble beaches on the south coast, and especially near the Jurassic Coast, and but yeah, it's also kind of big gay cultural epicenter as well, which is, I mean, make of that what you will. But anyway, but anyway,
but anyway,
back to the story.
back to the story. Yeah,
He then he has
we have a
he has
couple.
a
Go ahead. Sorry.
yeah he has a he starts tripping balls, and then he struggles to sleep, and then he has a particular vision of a man running down the beach, climbing over the groins, I think is how you pronounce it, the sort of dividing walls along the
I think it's
beach, and
groins. It's your
groins,
language, not
yes,
mine, but yes.
and he's running across trying to climb over the groins, and actually looking back at something chasing him, and then he collapses to the ground in exhaustion, and but then uh, he finds himself unable to shake these visions off, and then he decides to kind of distract himself with some reading, and then he eventually gets back to sleep. But then, yeah, he basically just trips balls all
Yeah,
night.
and he's the room he's in is a double. The only one they had left was a double room with two beds, and so the
Hmm.
maid or the servants are mentioning like, oh, were you sleeping in both beds? Did you try out both beds? He's like, no, I didn't try out. What are you talking about? Well, the other
Yes.
bed seems to have been slept in. So lots of
The
like jaw
sheets
jaw
on
jaw.
the sheets on the other bed have been disturbed, and
Yes.
the reader might first think that he might have just been he's probably just gone between the beds, or maybe there's something suspicious going on. So because it's not the most suspicious thing in the world, uh, but yes, it's sort of the first kind of mystery of the story, and yeah.
Well, and one thing too that I mean, I think some people have kind of not chided. There's been some mild criticism I've heard of M.R. James. Sorry, out of story meta moment. As a writer, but the way he with the way he characterizes the speech of less educated people in dialogue. Um, I don't see that as a critique at all. I see that as a really great thing about James. I really
You mean
like that he
he sort of
captures the
he
you know
transliterates the accents, you mean,
right. Well, it's
as it were?
dialects too.
Yeah,
I mean, and this is for me as somebody
yeah.
who, yes, have a dissertation in folklore and stuff, but I mean, I also have a great love, as people know from who watch the show, of linguistics. And I have, I've done dialect surveys. I've recorded people who speak endangered dialects. This is a thing I was doing for a few years. And so I love it when an author, perhaps imperfectly, perhaps somewhat stereotypically, but still attempts to capture the real fact that nobody speaks the same in any language in any place, right? There's always going to be distinctions between class, gender, backgrounds, region, all these things. And so it's kind of, I like that about James. I like that. I don't view that as James, talking down to anybody. I think he's actually trying to capture the distinctions between um, the character of Parkins, who speaks very standard we would imagine have some sort of early received pronunciation accent. That's at least how I imagine him, because he's an educated person from Cambridge, versus these people in East Anglia. And East Anglian's a cool accent. It's a cool dialect. I think it's cool. Maybe you as a Brit don't find it so cool. For me, it's all very exotic and fun, and so I like that. But it's nice, and it also just underscores the difference that like these people, quote unquote, are actually living a life. This is my opinion. This is my criticism that I think James is almost saying that like uh these people are living a life more connected to what actually is real, and of course they're going to sound different than this stuck up professor, and they are actually picking up, right, the in some ways the servants are more aware, or the staff of the hotel, of the inn, are more aware of that, like something strange is going on. Both beds have been slept in. Parkins brushes this off as just, oh, maybe I ruffled the sheets when I was putting my books bags down. It's like, well, he's blowing it off, right? And the people who maybe on paper aren't as smart are actually like, there's something weird going on here. And he's just, until the very end, is very unwilling to acknowledge the reality of what's happening. So that's just an interesting thing that I thought about. So,
Sure. As in, so your original point was about the, him writing the dialogue of the
well, and he does that
servants,
in all of
writing the dialogue
his
with servants
stories.
phonetically, as it were.
Yeah, a lot of his
Yeah,
stories, maybe I
because
won't say all, but in a lot of
I've
his stories, like even his stories that take place closer to quote unquote civilization, so in closer proximity to Cambridge and
sure,
or like
sure. No, yeah,
Oxford and or London, he still will have like if he's talking to, I think it was in another story, Tractate Midoff, which is another great story. He has, right, like there's a railroad clerk who is
mm,
he's talking to, who's sort of more lower middle class, is my understanding, not
mm,
totally poor, but like lower middle class, and he captures the distinction in the dialect phonetically,
mm-hmm,
perhaps imperfectly, but he's very
sure.
willing to do this in his writing, which I think is
I,
great. I think it's awesome. It's
I
neat.
mean, I would just find it strange how, I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if people like to in the past 10 years, let's say, would take offense at things like that. But I would find it very strange because now that you're just talking, we're just on the topic of phonetically spelling out people's act different dialects, whether it's English dialects. The most glaring example I can think of that is, dare I use this one, in Harry Potter, where J.K. Rowling
Harry Potter.
shamelessly, when she writes the dialogue for characters that have, a slightly divergent dialect, she will she'll be very, very phonetic about it. The main example of that is Hagrid, who has
Hagrid, yeah,
a West Country accent.
very West Country,
And
yeah.
then also when there are characters who are French and characters who are like Eastern European, or and then some German ones as well. She will like go so hard to
Based,
do the most, what is probably like stereotypically French, comically
right,
French, and it's that's probably another reason for her to be cancelled. But
yeah,
just talking about um the idea that M.R. James might be criticized for doing that, and then I'm just thinking of like, well, Harry Potter is so extremely recent, so extremely popular, and her phonetic writing of dialogue of different accents is extremely overt and shameless. No, just
well,
how I'm just curious how you could, yeah, there's withheld the criticism of her for that, or if it's
yeah,
offensive and racist, whatever,
I
it's
think I
funny.
think I think the turf stuff
Mm.
is more of what people are pissed off about her, whether she is
Yes,
that
but
or not.
they'll
Yeah,
find people. Yeah, they're also banned. They're also saying. I mean, clearly everyone's also saying stuff like, "I never liked Harry Potter anyway."
lies. Yeah. Well,
They're obviously also going on there.
as an
But
aside
yeah,
of an aside, it is interesting. When
yes,
so Rowling obviously does this in her English original text. When
yes.
I've read the first Harry Potter in Norwegian, and Norwegian is a language that
Hmm.
has a huge amount of dialect diversity. And actually, the translator, whose name I forget, of Harry Potter into Norwegian has different character. All of the characters speak different dialects of Norwegian to each other, which was really good. It's a good translation because
Hmm.
it captures this diversity of speech. Anyhow,
No,
I
they
mean,
have done. It's like, yeah, it's one of the most widely translated things ever.
yeah.
And no, yeah, I think I remember reading that myself, that different cultures have used their own sort of dialect differences that have a kind of local resonance, which
I
but
mean, this,
is just
pr- yeah,
allegorical to like the difference between received pronunciation and the West Country and stuff like that. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, and and
Yeah,
we have an upcoming episode that we'll get into hopefully with Mitch soon. That looks at we'll talk all about differences in pronunciation because I
sure,
still contend that
sure.
received pronunciation is fake and isn't real, but that's just me.
Oh,
I think
okay.
it's all fake. I think it's all
Well,
fake.
I
I
mean,
think it's
well, I
BBC
mean,
propaganda. But yeah,
I mean, it's here right now. But
you
I guess.
no, you don't have RP. Anyhow, we'll talk about that in another
Hmm,
episode. You actually don't have
hmm.
RP, and I
I
can
just
probably
can't.
prove
I
it.
can't speak anymore because I don't exist.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm erasing your identity. It's mine now. Yeah,
you're
it's
denying my right to exist.
um
Yes, exactly.
anyhow,
All that
but yeah,
stuff.
no, I mean the
Yes. Let's
practice
get back.
of
Yes.
capturing the speech of everyday people I think is cool.
Hmm.
And I think for the story and for all of James's stories where he does this, this might just be because I'm an American, but it does suck you
Hmm.
in. It takes you into the world. You're like, oh yeah, there's like we're not in this is England in the early 20th century, and the speech distinctions between classes is going to be probably even to a certain extent stronger, or at least stronger in a
Sure.
different way than it is today. And
Pe-
so that's neat. I like that.
Oh,
I
it
think
is.
that's a
It
great
is.
technique.
It is still strong today. It's just that people with the strongest divergent accents, if you want to call it that, are just not going to be on TV. Like that's just the
Except,
main.
well,
That's just the
yeah.
main gist of it. I mean, Hollywood has vaguely started to accept a few Northerners.
Anyhow,
Vaguely.
in any case, yeah.
Anyhow.
Well, we can say, we can say, maybe the Essex accent, Towie. No, that's a joke. The Essex accent is my favorite British accent. No, um, it's the only
Essex is
way.
all right. Yes, Essex
It's
is all
okay.
right, apart from the Anyways Essex, but you know.
Yeah. In any case, but yeah, no, the technique of drawing people in, I think is with accent is cool. It's nice. So anyhow, back to the story. Blows in the whistle. You should not do this. Bad things start to happen. He starts losing his shit because I think because he was just very, as a character, Parkins is very unwilling to admit that the supernatural is real. And I can't help but think, would he have been able to combat the supernatural force better had he acknowledged its reality and not just repressed it up until the
It's
very
also
moment of pure fright and terror.
also after he's spoken to the maids about his bed sheets, he then interacts with the colonel again, and he tells the colonel about the whistle, and the colonel lets his sort of he then talks about how you shouldn't use that thing if it used to belong to papists or something. That's when he that which kind of is I think that's where uh kind of more overt themes of the story are kind of coming out now as to uh what 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 is this hallucination? There's something I was thinking of this. Is this story supposed to be written in a way that's some kind of papist revenge for the Reformation, and it's coming back to haunt these hysterical and Protestants and stuff like that? That's the sort of I don't. That's just what was coming to me when I started reading. When I got to this point in the story, when I was trying to delve into the themes a bit, is this some sort of revenge, of papist revenge, and coming to haunt the present? I
That's a
was
good
curious
question.
about that one. Yeah.
Yeah. I was thinking a little bit about that last night when I was listening to the story again. Um, and now that I've listened to a few more, because again, I like to listen to ghost stories. Now that I've listened to / read a few more of James's stories, I'm not an expert on James, so I could
Hmm.
totally be wrong.
Sure.
But the he worked at Cambridge, taught at
Hmm.
studied at Cambridge, worked for Cambridge, and I think my impression that he was not a shitlib rationalist. Um,
No.
and
No.
he's a medievalist, and so I clock him as being very high church Anglican. Maybe not just in his style, in his way of being. Like, and his stories have they're not like overtly Catholic, because there are ghost stories that are overtly Catholic. There's horror that is overt, like
Sure.
The Exorcist, right? Is really a Catholic horror. It's
Sure.
really hard to have that story in any other context, religious
Sure.
context.
Sure. Hmm.
James to me seems very high church Anglican, and so the way
Is
I interpret
sorry.
the character of Colonel Wilson is James is poking fun at multiple. He's poking fun at shitlib academics, but also
Mm.
at these like weirdly like autistically Protestant, quote unquote, like low church Protestant uh
Sure, sure.
people who blame everything that's bad on the Catholics automatically, regardless of what it is. Right? It's a Templar
Mm.
church. You shouldn't have blown on the whistle. You do it. You didn't. It must be the Catholics' fault. And there's no explanation
Yeah,
as to
yeah,
why. It makes no
sure.
sense, and I think it's not supposed to make sense.
Mm. It
Like
also says,
hyper
sorry, yeah.
hyper polemic, hyper polemical Protestants. I think he's also
Mm.
poking fun at that, which to me strikes me as a very high church
Mm.
Anglican turn of the century deal, right? This return to ritual, return
Sure.
to not necessarily to Rome, but a return to tradition and ritual.
With with the
So,
interpretation of Anglicanism being Catholic light, which is, I
or
can
or
understand
just
why people say that, but I think it's an
English Catholic.
oversimplification.
I mean, or just
Yeah.
like Anglo Catholicism, right? Like
It,
that like it's the English kind of Catholicism, right?
I'm also just reading here that James's father was an evangelical Anglican clergyman. So this is his sort of upbringing background, I suppose. Whether that can affect him in a sort of positive or polarized direction, I'm not sure. But apparently, his father was an evangelical clergyman.
It's not
Yeah.
surprising to me.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I
Sure.
mean, again, as you've you said previously today that you can't talk about politics without talking about religion, at least in our current context, and I think that's
Mm.
definitely true for horror as a genre, right? There is, I mean, I guess
Mm.
you can technically have atheist horror, and there's been some examples of that, but the stories that people really remember, and the ones that get remembered and are sort of canonized for lack of a better term in sort of like popular understanding of like what are the great in this case ghost stories, what are the great horror stories, there always imply some sort of religious or spiritual world. Like there's just like
Sure.
you because and even as this is a thing I've talked about with other friends previously, is like even stories wherein there's no overt supernatural occurrences. I'm thinking of stories like The Wicker Man, the original, and
Of
the
course.
remake, but the original
No,
Wicker Man.
the
I'm
remake
thinking
does not exist. For
no,
God's sake.
it does exist. It does exist as a separate film.
Oh
Um,
God.
but also stories like Silence of the Lambs. I'm thinking of the movie versions, particularly
Mm.
Silence of the Lambs,
Mm.
or like Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Since I've said that one before,
Sure.
you don't see the evil, quote unquote. There's no like malevolent spirit that appears. But I mean, if you look at like what people are doing in like The Wicker Man, right? It
Mm.
seems as if something is driving them to commit horrible acts. Same thing with Texas Chainsaw. Same thing definitely with Hannibal Lecter. Like, is this man not
Mm.
somehow an agent of evil? I mean, he is clearly evil and clearly enjoys being evil. So even in those, you know, examples of horror where you don't see the spiritual force, you see its effects, and
Yeah.
the effects are so
There's
starkly, they're so bad. Like, how could it not be? Right? Like, there's something working behind the
there's
scenes.
there's no explicit sort of stylistic discrete delineation of horror with and without supernatural elements in the story, and I guess that's sort of helpful and not helpful. Helpful in the sense that you know whether there's actual supernatural elements in a story, you can still there can still be some general commonality with there being thoughts about evil just having supernatural components because it's just sheer evil. And yeah, two of my favorite films ever are Alien and The Thing. And
Amazing. Amazing.
yeah, and I guess in Alien there's most of the themes relating to morality and evil with the robot Kane, and when he's discussing his admiration of this creature that is, a perfect organism and a survivor. Uh, and yeah, that's a pretty. I mean, it was the effects of not a the special effects have not aged well in that particular scene, as anyone who's seen it will know. But that is a pretty sort of pivotal scene about themes and all that. But and yeah, the thing I just think is just a great
You got to be kidding me.
suspensive film.
You got to
Would
be
you not?
kidding me.
Do you not like the thing?
No, no, the line from the thing. You got to be kidding me, right?
Oh.
McGreedy, I think, yeah, you gotta be kidding me. Like it keeps splitting off. It's like, where is it? It's everything, it's
I know
everyone.
it's such
Yeah, yeah.
it's such it's such an ambitious concept for, you know, because obviously the aliens and the stuff had already happened, so they had to try a different concept if there was some sort of supernatural, not supernatural, some sort of extraterrestrial thing. And this is such a good attempt at that. And it's just the special effects are not that bad for the
I love
time.
them. I think they're great.
I think they, yeah, and yeah, I love the suspense.
It's
I love
really
the
good.
I love John Carpenter's music,
Yes, his
and
score is amazing.
it's so interesting to hear about how negatively reviewed it was when it first was released.
Well,
It got
and I mean,
extremely negative reviews when it was first released, and
one
then
of his
people then
yeah,
came round to it. I find
one
that
of
really
his greatest
interesting.
one of his greatest films got totally panned. I mean, it's one of my
Mm.
all-time favorites is Big Trouble in Little China. I mean, that nobody liked that.
Hmm.
I mean, now it's a classic, like a cult classic. I adore that film
Sure,
so much. One of my
sure.
top 10 favorites. I easily. But it was like it was not successful at the time. But I think that's
Mm.
because, and
Yeah.
I know we're on a tangent here, but it is relating to horror. I think,
No, yeah, it
Carpenter
is. Yeah.
Carpenter just he danced to his own tune, like he did his own stuff, and Hollywood did not appreciate that. So he did his own
Mm.
scores,
Yeah.
or or him and Alan Howarth would do the scores
Yeah.
together. They would just he just kind of did a lot of stuff on his own. So
Since we mentioned him, whilst I was reading this in preparation for today, I was actually listening. I thought I'd have some music on in the background, and I put on some. Recently, in recent years, Carpenter's released two albums called Lost Themes 2,
they're
and
very good.
they are, you know what I'm talking about, right? Yeah.
Yeah, they're very
So
highly
people
recommend.
who don't, they're basically kind of run off a compilation of run off tracks from, I don't know if they're from a variety of films, whatever, but yeah, they're basically just a kind of, it's just basically an a compilation album as if he was just some musical artist. But yeah, they're very worthwhile, worth checking out. And he's, yeah, there's one called Lost Themes and Lost Themes 2. I was listening to those when I was reading this, and
It's a
yeah,
good choice.
no, they are good. They are good albums. Anyway,
Anyways,
let's get back to the story.
yeah, yeah,
He then yeah encounters the colonel, who, you know, tells him about the papist nonsense of the um dismissal, and he returns to the inn, and then he encounters the terrified boy, who has apparently seen a figure at the window, which is the protagonist's window at the inn, and he he then tries to find, despite the fact there are some suspicious things about the story, because you know he's still trying so hard to rationalize what, you know, what is just a perfectly logical explanation. You know, maybe that he saw the maid at the window, but he goes in and finds that the room is locked, and the sheet on the unused bed has been disturbed again, and which is unexpected. But yeah, he it's a particular point where it's a kind of well, I don't want to call it like a desperation to find rational explanation of things, because I don't think he's actually having that dilemma. I think it's just him sort of going through the sort of natural motions he does whenever he encounters anything weird. I don't think he's currently having a dilemma about belief in the supernatural or not. I think that's just what he's doing. He's not quite reached a crisis point of his beliefs. I'm not sure we've reached that point yet, but it's sort of like a starting point for
it is.
his trying to find rational explanations for things. Yeah,
Well, and this
that's what I see it as.
that's a good point. The scrambling to find rational explanations for things. I think if we want to, at the risk of being slightly political, what on this channel, I mean, you see this a lot recently, and it's in it, the hyper rationalists are trying really hard to keep rationalizing everything away, or everything, and the more they try, the less everything fits in their worldview. And I mean, it's crumbling. And I think that this is a natural tendency of this
Hmm.
worldview, is that
I
it attempts to encapsulate everything in itself, and you can't, it just, that's impossible for any worldview, regardless of whether it's the correct. You can have a very good worldview, that but a good worldview, in my opinion, understands that there are more things than is dreamt of in our philosophy, and acknowledges that there's a limit to
sure.
human understanding. And you don't even, I'm not even talking about an explicitly Western or Christian worldview. There's other, that I think is just something that humans for millennia have, the smart humans for millennia have understood, that there is just limits to what you
Hmm.
can understand, because you are going to die. And even if you didn't
Not
die, the
only
world is so much bigger than what you are.
not
So,
only limits to what a single human brain can understand, but limits to like I don't know how much materials that an economy has to provide healthcare and housing and food for everyone in the drop of a hat. Sorry, that's a slight tangent, but you get what I mean.
no, yeah, but this idea that, well, because the hyper
Yes.
rationalist worldview is
Hmm.
it's
There's no
it's
limits.
it's paradoxical in that it attempts to, yeah, it says that it can understand everything, but then everything has no limits. So it's very weird, because it's very self-contradictory in this sense,
No,
because
there are contradict in the
yeah,
same people. Another thing I've just thought of in terms of like their contradictions is that the same sorts of people that like to think don't have a very materially constrained worldview are the same sort of people that like to kind of peddle um, Malthusian views about overpopulation
yeah,
and like usage of resources that is hurting the environment. Like at the next breath, they're talking about how like, right, we need healthcare for everyone. And I mean, the biggest kind of juxtaposition of these two views was with the climate crisis being alongside the COVID crisis. Because of course, the COVID crisis requires a vast amount of, manufacturing of single-use materials and plastics,
yep,
and then the climate crisis is just the complete antithesis of that. So
yep,
that's like the most stark time when this contradiction of constrained but unconstrained rationalistic views are just slapped together. And yeah, I can understand that.
yeah.
In this point in the story, though, I don't think there's quite been a crisis point of
No, the crisis is at the
yeah, it's
at the
not.
climax. Yeah,
Yeah, it's a sort of he's still going through his sort of instinctive
but do you not,
ritualistic rationalizing, but
do you
he's
not think that
also
deep down
found
inside,
something strange.
do you not think that deep down inside he understands he's fucked? Do you not think that
Um,
subconsciously he's like, oh, this is all real, and that everything he's doing at this point in the story is just him convincing himself that it's not real, that that he didn't actually curse himself by blowing the whistle? Because part of me can't help but think that that's what's going on. That from like, he at some point he finally gets it, but he just won't accept it. He will not accept that realization until it literally attacks him.
hmm. Well,
And
I think a lot of people can. I mean, certainly evidence today shows that people will still not accept stuff, no matter how much they get physically
right, well,
attacked.
yeah, but
Yeah,
there's
and
what you accept and there's what
so
you know
there's
what is real.
some people have no limits, but speaking of someone that can sort of put myself into the mind of a person like this, because there's probably vaguely similar cultural backgrounds we have. I can understand him just kind of, walking it off, or just putting on a stiff upper lip, or maybe that was more a post-war thing. Maybe that's not quite. I can sort of rational. I can sort of understand the idea of him sort of walking it off first, and then seeing the thing with the boy who's sort of seen the thing in his window, and he's like, he's not so concerned. I can sort of put myself in his point of view with that. I think I can vaguely understand why he'd just trying to walk it off, but yes, like it's sort of before the actual crisis point, and yeah,
Well, shall we get to the crisis point and just jump to the crisis point?
sure. What is it next? Yeah, it's
Yeah. So yeah, things again progressively get worse, right? The supernatural occurrences, whatever you want to call them, preternatural haunting effects continue. Um, and I mean, it gets to the point where you know, where I mean, he's attacked. Well, he's attacked by something in his room,
mm-hmm.
in the
Well,
spare bed, or from
it's
the
well
spare
it
bed.
well it uh, from my interpretation of it was that there was just something uh you know telekinetically moving his sheet into the form of a creature. So a creature was sort of using the linen to form some kind of humanoid thing, and that was what it was. As in, there wasn't actually any extra substance there. It's just the linen being manipulated to into the form of a human, and the crumpled face is just the crumpled linen, which is obviously still, you know, that's still something out of the ordinary. But yeah, I don't think there was any sort of extra substance there
I mean,
outside of what he could. Yeah.
yeah, that's like that's the final physical manifestation, or maybe it's the only real physical manifestation of the entire story, right? Because everything else seems to be sort of more spiritual in the sense of mental, like something projecting into his consciousness. People are seeing things and freaking out, but it's not like books are flying off the shelves or something like that. But there is a sheet that is moved. Um, and
Hmm.
that's also interesting to me as somebody who's also I guess I am a published author in this field. I am actually um in uh not parapsychology per se, but in the history of parapsychology, and sort of various theories about how, if hauntings are real, how do they actually occur. And this was also something that was very much in the air, in the water at this time period, particularly in England. Society for Psychical Research in London is still a thing. It was very popular at this time period. A little bit earlier, like before the story was written, you get people like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, like, uh, going to seances to try to contact his, it's just interesting stuff. I guess that was a little bit later, after World War I, right? Him trying to contact his son. Just there's whether or not people believed in ghosts, it was very exciting to talk about ghosts and think about ghosts, and to think about, if ghosts are real, is there a scientific way we can study them? And again, that feels strange. I think that feels strange for a lot of modern, perhaps only Americans, but I think for moderns in general, or postmoderns, because we're like, wait, they're trying to use science to talk about the supernatural. It's like, yeah, because even in this time period, turn of the century, the distinction between science and supernatural wasn't as strong as it really. There you got people like the Bell telephone company trying to make a telephone to talk to the spirit world. They tried that, it didn't work. But that was a real.
Thomas Edison tried that. I remember. I know that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's
Mm.
so people were putting R&D money, research, into like trying to do this. And so
Mm.
it's interesting. And I don't, again, as a good ghost story author, James does not explain any of this, right? He just presents you with terrifying, strange, bizarre occurrences. But
I've just
it is
I've
interesting
just
that this
got
is the spirit does appear to be only strong enough to. I mean, the only real physical manifestation it can do is move a sheet around, which is a really relatively, like, it's not like Cthulhu ripping the cosmos in two. It's not like a undead corpse reanimated, draining the lifeblood from you like Dracula. It is just a sheet moving, so it's a relatively low powered enemy, to maybe borrow a little bit of D&D terminology. um but it is enough to completely kind of wreck Parkin's under, like, ability to
mm,
it's not just terrifying in that, there's a strange sheet moving around. It's that the implications of the sheet, right? That there is something,
mm,
an other, and a otherworldly intelligence that's working upon him, and he can't deny it anymore. It's not
sure.
lack of sleep, it's not undigested food. It's like, that's a real thing that happened to him. um
I've got the final three paragraphs in front of me, and I
yep,
think I'll just read
read
them
them.
out now to kind of help illustrate the point. Uh, so yeah, exactly what explanation was patched up for the staff and visitors at the hotel, I must confess, I do not recollect. So something we haven't mentioned before. This is all the whole story is from the third person. It's not from the first person of Parkins, and that sort of does kind of that creates more mystery about what this is and what Parkins thinks about all this, and you know it's all external to his thoughts and his thoughts about his changing thoughts of supernatural. We only hear it when he says, "I don't believe in this stuff." So we don't actually know what his thoughts are ever. Intervened when he did. He would either have fallen out of the window or else lost his wits. But it is not so evident what more the creature that came in answer to the whistle could have done than frighten. There seemed to be absolutely nothing material about it save the bedclothes, of which it had made itself a body. The colonel, who remembered a not very dissimilar occurrence in India, was of the opinion. was of opinion that if Perkins had closed with it, it could really have done very little, and that its one power was that of frightening. The whole thing, he said, served to confirm his opinions of the Church of Rome. Sorry. There is really nothing more to tell, but as you may imagine, the professor's views on certain points are less clear-cut than they used to be. His nerves, too, have suffered. He cannot even now see a surplice hanging on a door quite unmoved, and the spectacle of a scarecrow in a field late on a winter afternoon has cost him more than one sleepless night. So yeah, it's extremely brief as to how things have affected him, and yeah, it's an external perspective that the story is told. So yeah, but
Well, yeah.
and it's a very short paragraph. The final paragraph, which talks about the way it's affected him, is extremely short. But yeah, it's and even the author seems to kind of be this more dismissive, uh, rationalistic person who's just trying to find the most simplistic explanation. Is like, okay, we accept that apparitions exist, so we're going to be as clinical as we can to say this apparition has just made the sheet moved, but not absolutely nothing material about it save the bedclothes, as he says. And so he's like, okay, we accept the ghost exists. So this is the most clinical environment we're going to work in, whilst we've accepted that ghosts exist. It's
Yeah,
interesting.
it is interesting. And
Mm.
the one thing to make the through line to what I was saying before. So like one of the reigning theories, it wasn't the only theory, it was never the only theory, but one of the more popularized theories, largely because of movies um such as Ghostbusters, probably the best movie ever made, in my opinion.
Oh
Uh,
wow.
yeah, I know. I will defend that. I will defend that to the death. Is ectoplasmic theory. So the idea that like this was a reigning theory for a long time, particularly in the late 19th, early 20th century, like with sort of spiritualism craze, was that ghosts, spirits can manifest themselves, not using just pure like unexplained supernatural force. They actually can create like a spiritual body for themselves out of ectoplasm that they draw from the surrounding environment. And so this is not ectoplasmic projection or apparition here. It's a sheet. It's kind of interesting. It's like it's using a bed sheet. I have never
Sure.
heard of that, but it is interesting. We can't interview MR James. I'm not a spiritualist, so I can't do that. That's a joke. But it is interesting because it's a similar kind of idea that but instead of using ectoplasm, right, it's a bed sheet. I don't think that was intended to be funny. I think that was just intended to be spooky, scary, which it is. But it is also kind of
Sure.
interesting. It's like, oh, he's using a bed sheet. I mean, and if ghosts are real, and if, at least for the purposes of the story, and if they can project uh their intelligence into our world, why not use a bedsheet? I mean, it's actually a really good question. Why does it have to be some sort of strange ectoplasmic substance? Why couldn't it just be
Hmm.
anything that's physical, that maybe is lightweight? And that is a common thing too. You tend to find in parapsychological writings of this time period, but also today, the idea that like ghosts are have a relatively low power, and therefore can only work on very lightweight objects, unless they're incredibly
Hmm.
malevolent and strong, in which case they might like throw books or something like that. So again, objective spiritual reality aside, it is interesting to read this story, particularly this climactic ending, within the context of England in this time period, right? Where even if James, I think, would be very much not knowing, not being an expert on James, I think James would be very open to the idea of supernatural being like, and not
Hmm.
just like religion, but like the fact that ghosts could be real. I mean, he seems like somebody who's open to that. Regardless of his own opinion on it, though, like that idea was very much in the water, and everyone was talking about it. It was really a big deal. Um, it's weird how much it's weird because simultaneously, like over the past 100 years or so, it's weirdly become more normalized that there's things like ghost hunting shows, Ghost Adventures, right? Zach Bagans, one of my favorite guilty pleasures. I love the shit out of that show. It's so dumb and I love it. it's interesting because that's become more normalized, but then also people care less about it. It's like, oh yeah, there's
Sure. No,
Discovery, this show's about, but we don't really care about it.
there
Whereas
was
in this time period, I mean, people were having big public debates about like, are are mediums real, and are they conjuring ghosts or demons, or what is happening? Like this was
there
a
was
real thing that people were really like cared about, and now nobody
mm,
cares anymore. They're like, yeah, maybe it's real, maybe it's not, I don't care. It's kind of
something that's just
interesting.
I just looked up ectoplasms now. Apparently, the concept of it is very late 19th century. So quite soon before this story was written. And also, a name has come up to me, which I just remembered that Arthur Conan Doyle was a very particular believer in supernatural things, and he himself had these descriptions of ectoplasms as like a gelatinous substance, even though not all ectoplasms didn't start out just as all these gooey liquids, but yeah, it
That's
has.
really more of a
I
Ghostbuster. The
am
Ghostbusters took it to the
the
gooey
ghost.
level
Yeah,
for fun,
the ghost, the
Yeah,
Ghostbusters was the massive popularizing thing, but the
yeah.
the gooey stuff did exist before, but it originated not so much. But I am reminded of Arthur Conan Doyle, which I'm not an expert on, but he was despite the time that he was right, he was a very strong believer
Yeah, big spiritualist.
in
Yeah,
and he actually fell out with Houdini
yeah,
because he was insisting that Houdini's tricks were real, and yeah, it's so interesting how you get figures like Arthur Conan Doyle who had such beliefs like this. And yeah,
yeah.
I'm reminded of that now.
Yeah, no, and so yeah, it's and then yeah, this and again for characters in the story such as Wilson, it's all just proof that the Catholics are at fault for everything. Which is just that is, I think that's
Yeah.
designed to be funny. That's designed to be a little
Mhm.
bit of humor. Like I can't, yeah,
Sure.
that's
Yeah. I mean,
humorous.
I'm guessing because obviously, my view of like you know, in which I've kind of come to quite recently, and I think it's a good one of sort of interfaith interaction, whatever you want to call it, especially between Catholics and Protestants in an English context. Like, I just I think that it's legitimate for what the relationship should be is dependent on particular circumstances and time. So there's not really a justification for it to be timelessly antagonistic, but also timelessly like friendly and kumbaya, which people today like to try and if there's too much kumbaya as we have today, you're just basically kind of ignoring the overt differences that there might exist between Catholic and Protestant thinking, and that's a problem. But and for more obvious reasons, to be timelessly antagonistic is a problem because it's just the idea that there's no reconciliation of existence. So,
That's the
uh,
most
what?
Anglican answer I have ever heard in my life to that question. So
Well,
very
there we
British.
go. Where
Very,
there we go then.
yeah,
Where there we go then. No, yeah, I mean there are. Yeah, I've come to the end that there are limitations to the just timeless kumbaya that people would like. Lots of people would like us to have, except maybe Irish Republicans who can all just go to hell. Anyway, um, no. So at the time of writing of this story, I'm just curious how if that was just supposed to be a sort of joke about what level of cordiality of relations that Catholics and Protestants were having at the time, whether it would be light-hearted, or I can imagine there was not as much kumbaya then as there is
less
now.
kumbaya, less kumbaya.
Less, yeah. So
Yeah.
well, God knows what else was going on elsewhere in the country and
Well, I mean, you had
in a
in
place. But yeah,
Ireland, in Northern Ireland, and all of Ireland. Well, there was all of Ireland. Yeah, that was a very
well
much
that I mean,
deal.
well
Yeah.
yes, that was a little bit later from 1904. Obviously,
Well,
there was stuff going on.
it
There
was
was
heating
stuff.
up. It
I
was
mean,
heating up. It was heating
there
up.
was
Yeah.
stuff. No, yeah, there was. I mean, yeah, it was just in the run up to the Irish Free State. But I mean, the stuff that I most know have most sort of like acknowledgement of is more recent, of course. But anyway, yeah, I'm just curious. Yeah, it's very the sort of the state of the relations between Catholics and Protestants is just always going to be and ought to be dependent on particular circumstances. And what I mean by that, there's no justification for it to be timelessly antagonistic or friendly. So I'm curious what the manifestation was now to and how that if that's a joke, how it would have flown into public audience to popular
Yeah,
audiences. Yeah,
I'd have to read up on it again.
yeah,
My being a non-expert, my take on it is this is, you know, James is connected to Cambridge, therefore he's connected to, whether he wants to be or not, to Anglo-Catholicism, to High Church Anglicanism, and this feels, that's very much feels like a dig on on hyper polemical low
sure.
church Protestants, is what how I read that. It's also just funny.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I
And
sort of
Colonel
laughed when I was
Wilson's a
reading it, and
military
if,
man. He's a military man, so there's always that
of
low church
course, yeah,
kind of, you know, Calvinist
yes, no,
march on that to do.
the colonel, the colonel archetype is something that has survived right up until, like, Faulty Towers and in the 1970s. But of course, instead of Catholics, they would talk about Germans
Right.
because it's. But I imagine, but the archetype is sort of still the same, and I think that's refreshing that the archetype is like more timely, even though the framing is a little different. But yeah, I find that
Yeah.
funny. And yeah, if I if I sort of instinctively found that funny, then maybe that's what it was supposed to be, rather than some sort of like deep theme about, I don't know, Catholic revenge for
I don't think
for
it, yeah.
haunting this man from the grave for the the brutality of the Reformation, whatever. I don't know. But yeah, maybe the fact that I just had an instinctive laugh was, maybe that's what it was supposed to be.
I
So maybe I should just trust my gut on that one.
trust your gut. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Not all the
Um,
time, but maybe this time.
maybe this time. Yeah. So well, any sort of final thoughts about the story or James himself or anything we talked about? Any final, yeah, final conclusionary thoughts?
Well, yeah, I came to this discussion to kind of get some second opinions on things, because I was, I didn't think I was qualified enough to get the best meaning out of it on my own, just simply because I'm as not as literary as other people. And I do find more humor in it than I did before, especially with kind of how he does often, like, because like the idea of him having these sorts of haunting experiences and these mysterious happenings, and the idea he's sort of trying to walk it off and just like bustle through. That does sort of resonate with me a bit. I
Very
don't know if
British.
I the whole stiff upper lip thing, I imagine, is a bit of a sort of post hoc of the Second World War. So I don't think it's entirely that kind of thing, but but it is a little bit more timely than that, and I just find that funny because I sort of feel that same way myself a lot of the time. So I do find more humor in it now than I did when I first read it. Um,
Yeah,
but
James is actually
yeah,
quite funny. Eh,
sure,
Yeah.
sure.
Or maybe
And
not funny. He's quite witty, let's say.
there's
There's some witty bits in his stories.
on top of that, I've something I've not mentioned yet, but I did also found funny when I first read it, is that a lot of the time there's basically a breaking of the fourth wall, and the reader is like literally being referred to, and like sometimes there'll be these throwaway comments. It's like the reader might not find this detail interesting, but here, like, yeah, it's like it's a sort of fourth walling that I've not really. I mean, I've read literature which has like a hell of a lot of sort of modernist fourth walling. Like, when I was younger, I used to read Series of Unfortunate Events, and I read that book, I Am the Cheese, which is like absolute postmodern meta fiction. I've read children's literature with particularly modernist, postmodernist sort of fourth walling. But yeah, this was it's quite it's just interesting to see these little throwaway fourth wallings here and there, and even when it's quite cynical.
Yeah,
Yeah, that I
oftentimes
yeah. Mm.
oftentimes James writes in the from the perspective of like a third person narrator who heard this from the person or from somebody who knew it. So there
Sure.
oftentimes it is this like transmission of like like a second or third hand. This is what a thing I heard. That is not all the time, but very often is his mode or his sort of his framing for the narration, which is cool. I actually really like that. I think that's
Mm.
because what I mean, this is probably this would be a topic for another episode if you're interested.
Mm.
Is do you have any, does any, do you, not necessarily you Fred, but do you, quote unquote, does one have any stories that one has experienced of things that made no sense, right? And if you hear stories of people, you're not, this strange thing happened to me once, and this is where my uncle once had a blah, like this is how ghost stories are folklore. There, and this is for me putting my
Mm,
folklorist hat on. They're a variety. They're a kind of folklore, and they've
mm,
existed in every single culture that has ever existed in the history of humanity.
mm,
It just is. They're the oldest genre, is what a lot of people say. It's like, if you count ghost stories in with myth, which they're kind of myth, so it's all kind of myth, folklore, ghost. It's all this nebulous cloud. But ghost stories are an example of folklore, and oftentimes, the fact that James sat down, people like James sat down and wrote and published ghost stories is relatively recent. For most of the history of ghost stories, it's been people sitting either, I'm bored, we're at work together, let me tell you this one exciting story while we're working to make this, we're going to make the harvest less boring today or less hard. Or we're, tired at the end of the day, we're sitting around the campfire or the hearth or wherever, right? Let me tell you this one story, that is sort of really like the origin of these, or the original mode that these stories would be told in. And
sure.
oftentimes those stories are like there once was a man, in whereversville, and this one thing happened. um it could be as disconnected as that, or it could be very connected to the teller of the story. My granddad once told me that, or it could be I experienced this thing once. And so I like that, because that is what ghost stories really always have been. And James, I think, is cluing the reader in, even just subconsciously, with how he frames the stories, his telling of the
Mm,
stories. So I think that's great. I think that's awesome, because it's not
sure.
like
Yeah.
it's is it fiction? It's fiction, but it's not overtly fiction, right? It's unclear how fictional it is, even though it is fiction.
Sure.
But you can start to, you can, maybe this did happen. Um,
Hmm. I do find the sort of very externalized tone of it uh quite interesting on that way, as if it there's a sort of distance between the actual reader of the story and the characters, because it's not only is it third person, but there's just a lot of externalizing, and I guess that sort of links into the kind of campfire at the end of the day of of
yeah,
hard working in the field kind of thing, and the mystery of it is through the further externalizing. So yeah, I
yep,
can understand that.
yep,
I've also just had a thought about how these sorts of stories were just before this big explosion of interest in fantasy that came down a few decades down the line with Tolkien and stuff like that. And I wonder if if ghost stories are some sort of fundamental precursor to
yes.
sort of more grand fantasy. If
They
yeah,
are.
I'm
They are.
curious about
They
that
are.
one.
And
Yeah.
many people have written
Mm,
about this. They are. And
mm,
they are.
sure.
This is, yeah. That like, again, this stuff Lewis would have, I mean, Lewis, Tolkien, Barfield, people like this were very much like,
Sure.
because these ghost stories are kind of the resurgence of ghost stories that you get in sort of the Victorian period, and then at post-Victorian period. It is kind of this, I mean, many people have said this, so this is not my original idea, is that, and it's very clear, I think, is the pushing back of the ancient onto the modern, right? That there's this like, we're getting too modern, we're getting too rational. It's like, what about all the
Mm,
things we don't understand? What about those? Do they go away? Maybe they come back and haunt you. And I mean, I know I'm not a huge fan of Derrida. I am not. But
mm,
Derrida has this
of
idea of
course
haunt.
not.
But a broken clock can be right twice a day. That can happen.
I know.
if I
Sure.
may, is,
No, 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 no. Go, yeah, go ahead.
is
Yeah.
is is hauntology, right? The
Mm,
ontology of being haunted by the past. And I think that that's another thing
mm,
that ghost stories all have in common too, is they are literally about the past coming back to you, and that
mm,
that history matters. There is no tabula rasa, there is no blank slate, there is no end of history Fukuyama style. That doesn't exist. It's never existed. We are all born into history. History affects us, and then we exit history, and then maybe we haunt someone else, metaphorically speaking, hopefully. But like the past is like, it has these effects, and as try as
mm,
we might, we can't reduce it or get rid of it. And you can't, it's there, and you don't want to see it. It's terrifying, but then it jumps out at you, right? And that's a thing that I think all ghost stories have in common. And I think that that is an
mm.
inherently, not even politically reactionary. It's just a like
No.
it's a
Well,
reactionary
it
idea
is
that like it's there.
it is reactionary now,
It's
but
reactionary now.
but
I
it
think it's just
in but
normal.
it in its sort of underlying essence, of course, it's become reactionary now. And to be
Right.
honest, if all this stuff is becoming reactionary, then like I say, bring it on. Let's
Let's
create the
just
big
do it.
reactionary melting pot until
If
it
if
explodes.
if the reactionaries
Um,
wrote some of the
yeah.
greatest ghost stories in the English language, then why is that a bad thing? I mean, these are
I mean,
these are great stories.
the
Yeah.
reactionaries think we shouldn't give HRT to children, then maybe, that's the point we're at now.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, on top of how, yeah, there's limits to how much we can denounce the past. Just also, yeah, it's just got me thinking about how this is supposed to give an idea of the limits to the understanding of an individual mind and people, because people back at this time, certainly it was sort of it just gone past the peak of the what I like to call the sort of progressive revolution when it came to thinking about politics and general welfare and the Fabians and all that, and where whilst people had these grand ideas about the welfare of all mankind, the medium for all of that is still at the end of the day individual people's minds, and you can't pull people's minds together to have a greater capacity to have more understanding. Even obviously people can collaborate with each other, but you can't physically pull together the capacity of people's minds. And so at the end of the day, people still can only understand as much as they know. And henceforth, there should be a that's why a division of labor in society exists in order that people people's capacity is put to use in a particular area. And I suppose just the idea we need to be reminded of the capacity of an individual mind is sort of come to me whilst you've been talking about that, about how we can't ignore the past, and yeah, just and yeah, as we said, contradictions about believing in an unconstrained material worldview, but then also believing in other this leading to other constrained views, and yeah, it's just all ridiculous. But yeah, yeah,
Yeah. And I mean, maybe the solution in the end is to just frighten rationalists. Maybe they just maybe a haunting needs to occur metaphysically or metaphorically, maybe not metaphysically, but a metaphorical
mm.
haunting. Maybe that's a thing that can snap people out of a this ridiculous hyper rationalist
Yeah,
worldview.
I'm curious what would frighten people. What real examples today would actually frighten people? Because I'm certainly people have started to. I mean, I've known people that have become Christians. Not so personally. I've heard testament of people that have become Christians because of stuff that happened to them, or because of. I mean, the more sort of classic case is that they've had a traumatic situation in their life, and Christianity has been a savior for them. And I mean, that's the more kind of cynical stuff that people say is the only utility of Christianity, opium of the people, whatever. Um, and I think in the modern world, it will come from a lot of people having uh, a dilemma about the modern world and finding meaning from it. And, unfortunately, I think that's where a
Maybe
lot of it will come. But yeah, I'm
maybe part
curious.
of it will come from people realizing that you cannot choose every single individual aspect of your identity, and there are things that are just real about you that you didn't choose.
Yes, there are people that can kind of make an attempt at squaring this circle. The so-called LGB people, LGB no T people, will like these are people that are the full believers in the capital G, capital L, the sexual revolution and the ideals of the sexual revolution, capital L, capital S, gay liberation. Sorry, sexual revolution, sexual liberation, liberation with a capital L, which is just these, if you actually read the ideas, they're just these radical notions of how an eventual ideal end will be that everybody in the world has an indiscriminate sexuality and that there'll be no discrimination on the basis of uh, people's sex, as in people are just inclined to act on their desires to everyone. And then these are the people that are supposedly the reactionaries when it comes to the trans stuff. And it's just like you can't really square this circle forever. The idea that you are, you know, uh, trying to halt the brakes on progress, but you're also these fucking radical revolutionary feminists or whatever it may be. It's just kind of there are people that are trying to square this circle, and as I was saying before, uh, there are some people that can be physically attacked by the reality of these things they don't want to believe, and they'll still not believe them. And I
Well, I
I
mean, but
think there are people
look
that
at
are arrogant enough to try
look at
and square
reaction.
this circle for the rest of their life.
Well, we're all square in circles in a way, but that's probably a topic for another day.
Sure,
But
more
look at
specific circle. Yeah,
look at the physical reactions to being confronted with ideas that people on
Hmm.
the far left
Yeah,
get. I mean, it's like
sure.
they've been, and they'll say, "I've
Certainly
been attacked." I mean, they'll say
the
things like that. It's like they're being haunted. They're being haunted by
the
ideas that are uncomfortable to them. And I mean, you get
sure.
similar level of boomer freak out on, at least in America, on the right, whatever passes for the
Oh
right.
yeah.
Yeah.
No,
I mean, you get the
yeah.
yeah.
I
So
mean, I
that's,
recently
I
read
think it,
about like
yeah.
sorry, actually no, sorry, Karen.
No, that's an
Right.
example, I think, of being haunted by an idea. And maybe,
Sure,
and an ideas are spiritual, right? Ideas exist
of course.
in a
Yeah.
spiritual sense, and they haunt us. And I think that's maybe a way and maybe they haunt us for good or for better or for worse, depending. But maybe that's a way that people can be haunted. Maybe
Mm.
some hauntings are good. Maybe we need to be haunted by certain ideas or certain realizations. I don't know.
Because I am now I'm now laughing, looking back to about 2016, where there were these viral videos of like people that had seen a certain bad person speak, and they would run outside, and someone had videoed them, and they're literally like crawled up
Yeah,
against the wall, like crouching in a sort of,
fetal position. Yeah,
and they're screaming.
yeah.
They're screaming.
But how
And
is that not like
but
the
and
final
I
girl after every single right slasher film? Like she's running and she's
sure,
screaming. That's
but at the
the
same
exact reaction.
but at the same time, I still think that those sorts of people who have these visceral reactions, these visceral reactions to, a lot of it was back in 2016, it was people that were talking about how, women should be accountable for their actions, blah, blah, blah. I don't think they are actually more likely to be convinced. They're likely to actually have a shake in their faith. A lot of the time, it can actually be quite reinforcing. I'm not saying that,
Yeah.
you know, I think
Well, maybe they want to be
I
haunted.
think the limit yes, maybe there is
They
some.
want
I
to
mean,
be haunted.
a lot of these people are very damaged people. A lot of their reaction things are because of their own like abused childhood or whatever the fuck it's about. Where a lot of it will just be them wanting to find some sort of comfort in an abusive situation, which is literally the way that most abuse operates these days. A lot of it's not actually, someone just victimizing someone else. Someone is seeking victimization because that's all they've ever known in their own upbringing,
Yeah.
etc., etc. But yeah, it's people can be. Yeah, I'm just think we should acknowledge more the capacity people can have to be whacked over the face with something and and not believe it. It's such is the way with how arrogant some of these people are. But yeah,
Yeah.
I don't
Well,
want that to be true, but yeah.
on that
Yeah.
uplifting note, maybe
Sorry,
this is a good
sorry.
place to end. No, that's
I'm
fine.
sorry. I
Well,
didn't
no, we're
mean that to
talking
be the
about
end
ghost
note.
stories. We're talking about ghost
Oh
stories. They don't.
yes, I didn't mean that to be the
There doesn't
final
need to be a
note, but
happy end.
yes.
Yeah.
No, yeah, I've really enjoyed doing. I now find I find this story more comedic than I did when I first read it, and I'm really appreciative that I do now. And yeah, I will check out some more. I mean, I'm really interested by M.R. James's wider academic work, or maybe his wider political views, because there is a few sources on that, and whether he had any intricate views as a reactionary, because obviously there are all these intricate reactionary philosophers like Carlyle or whatever it may be, and I'm sort of disinclined a bit by Carlyle, so I'm curious to find one that kind of gets with me a bit. So yeah, I am curious to
Well,
dive into
yeah,
more stuff. Yeah,
obviously we'd love to have you back on, and whether it's to talk
sure,
about more James stuff, or James himself, or any of that stuff,
sure,
just keep us
yeah,
informed.
man.
Yeah, thanks, and again, enjoy your the hottest summer on record in all of UK history, and
Oh, the
um
coldest summer,
yes,
coldest summer with a nice hot lip in September.
yeah. And like I said, I'm going to be very much enjoying the leaves falling, and reading more ghost stories. And yeah, everyone, thank you for entertaining us rambling about this. I know we kind of moved around a bit, but this is your brain on ADD, and that's okay. We talk about a lot of different things. Please do check out the story. I'll link to it. It's public domain, has been for a long time. Again, I think it's still up there. The BBC special is fun. It's a little different than the story, but it is really good. Michael Horton does a great job at playing Parkins. And yeah.
Can I just also, just on that note,
Yeah,
just
please.
quickly, there is another adaptation from 2010 which I've not seen, but the mere fact that it stars John Hurt,
Yeah, Hurt.
which, if John Hurt is in it, you can just tell that there's bound to be something worthwhile in looking at it. And there's also Sophie Thompson, who is Emma Thompson's little sister,
Huh.
who is a good actress. She's been in various like either Bronte or Jane Austen adaptations. So she's a good actress, and she was in Harry Potter as well. Apparently that also exists, and you should check that out. And I'm going to check it out as well because I love John Hurt. He's great.
He is great.
Anyway,
R.I.P. Yeah. Cool. And with that, yeah, please like, comment, subscribe, all the things, and we shall be back hopefully before too long with more stuff with Fred. Thank you, Fred.
thank you.
Yeah.
Goodbye.
Bye.